Hello, welcome to the ALCTS webinar on negotiation of e-resource licensing and pricing terms. I'm Felicity Dykes, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenter today is Abbie Brown. Abbie is Head of Consortial Resources for the University of Missouri System. In that role, she negotiates consortial e-resource licenses and contracts for the consortium, and she manages e-resources for 2 of the campuses. She's been working in this area for several years, so we're really fortunate to have her present for us today. Everyone in the audience is muted, so if you have questions for Abbie, please type them into the question box on your screen. Abbie will answer the questions following her presentation, and if we go over time, she'll answer the remaining ones offline, and we'll send those out to all participants. Today's session is being recorded, so you'll receive an email with a link to that and the slides. We don't have a chat function that allows you to chat with each other, but if you like, use that Twitter hashtag that's on the screen. We're not going to monitor that, so again, please use that question box if you have comments and questions for Abbie. And now, here's Abbie. There'll be a slight delay as we switch speakers.
Hi, my name is Abbie Brown, and like Felicity said, I am the Consortial Resources Head at the University of Missouri System. I've been negotiating e-resources and libraries for several years. I really love it, and I'm happy to be here today. This will be a kind of a fairly short presentation on the topic, which is a pretty big topic, and I want to mention that we're focusing specifically on negotiation and not the details of licensing and pricing. I mean, we'll be talking about these, but it will be within the confines of the. Sorry, somebody's trying to come into the room. We will not be able to get into a lot of detail today, but hopefully there will be question and answer after this, and you can ask me specific questions then. And also, you can send me emails, and I'll be putting my email address up here in just a second. So, and the question was on the dashboard there on the side, just like Felicity said. Okay, now I'm going to switch to my slides. Okay. So today we are talking about the negotiation of e-resource licensing pricing terms. And here's my email address, brownab@missouri.edu. Feel free to write this down. I'll also have it up at the end. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at any time. Today we're going to first talk about, we're going to define some terms. We're going to talk about negotiation in theory. We're going to talk about negotiation in practice, and then there'll be a short conclusion and time for question and answers at the end. Here's some different terms that we'll be using today. These seem pretty obvious, probably, to anybody who's been doing anything with this at all, but let's just go through this real quick. E-resources, these refer to e-journals, e-books, or databases. We're talking specifically about e-resources here today because e-resources are different than other library resources. The complexity of the licensing agreements, the need to set up access, the confusion over pricing models. When e-resources came onto the scene, librarians started purchasing directly from publishers and vendors rather than using serials vendors because of these differences. Not that they weren't doing it directly before, but it became definitely more direct purchasing after that. Vendors are the organization that sells or distributes the e-resource. That's the term I'll be using today to describe pretty much anybody who's in that situation. That could be large and small. They could be database aggregators or individual journal publishers. They could be for-profit or not-for-profit. And then the vendor reps from those organizations can vary widely too. You may have a specific sales rep's name and email, or you may communicate with an email address that is answered by a dozen different people. You may have one sales rep who is your main point of contact for all issues, or you may have a series of different contacts depending on your problem. Large vendors often have an inside salesperson and an outside salesperson. The outside salesperson would handle new products. The inside salesperson would handle renewals. That would be the way that it's often set up. In smaller vendors, that's not usually the way it's set up. Consortia. A consortium is an association of two or more organizations that forms to participate in a common activity. And in this case, consortia are groups of libraries that leverage buying power of multiple institutions together. There are quite a lot of consortia, not just in the United States, but internationally. So what I do is I represent a consortium that is small, made up of the University of Missouri Systems campuses and some outside libraries as well. But consortia can be quite large and can be made up of both academic and public libraries, special libraries, all sorts of things. So a consortium leverages its buying power by bringing more libraries to the table, which means more potential sales for the vendor. There's one license agreement for that vendor and one invoice, so they don't have to chase everybody down. And this kind of savings often means some savings for the participants as well. But there might be administrative charges that come from the consortium, so it can vary on whether that's going to be your best deal. But these are something we'll be talking about here today. Licensing is obviously the contract that you sign to get access to the e-resource, but in broader terms, it's defining the legal relationship between your library and the vendor, and that really can't be understated. It's a very important thing, what you're doing with that. Negotiation, we'll be talking more in detail, but the basic definition of negotiation is to hold a discussion to reach an agreement over a particular matter. And assertiveness is something we're going to be talking about today. The quality of being self-assured and confident without being either aggressive or submissive is the definition of assertiveness. So we're going to start off with talking about negotiation in theory. There's quite a lot out there on negotiation. If you want to get into the negotiation theory, there are quite a lot of books. I'll mention a few at the end. Two styles of negotiation right away that you can think of are soft negotiation and hard negotiation. Soft negotiation, the goal is agreement. We insist on agreement. Everybody's friends. We don't want to upset the apple cart. We don't want to worry about it. We will accept any one-sided loss just in order to get to that agreement. While on the other hand, you have hard negotiation, where the goal is to win. You insist on your position. People are adversaries. They're untrustworthy. You apply pressure. This is the Glengarry Glen Ross over here on hard negotiation. And soft negotiation can be the mark that they have. And so neither of these are the best place to be. These are two ends of a continuum. The place in the middle is what they call principled negotiation. And to contrast with the other idea that the goal is either agreement or to win, instead the goal is a wise outcome. Instead of insisting on agreement or insisting on your position, you're insisting on using objective criteria, and that's where things like usage statistics come in to play, depending on how objective those usage statistics are, right? People are friends, or everyone is trustworthy, or people are adversaries and untrustworthy. No, people are all problem solvers. Everyone in this situation is a problem solver, and it doesn't matter whether you trust them or not. They're there to solve the problem. Instead of yielding to pressure or being the one to apply pressure, you yield to principle and not pressure. You reason and you're open to reason. And instead of accepting one-sided losses to reach agreements or demanding one-sided gains as the price of the agreement, you invent options for mutual gain, or what they call win-win outcomes. If you're familiar with Stephen Covey, quite a lot of detail there. I want to contrast this with communication styles. It's not really a contrast, but it's very similar actually, and that's where we're going to talk about assertiveness. Where you have a hard negotiator, you may have an aggressive communicator, a person who doesn't respect personal boundaries, who tries to influence people so hard that they might be harming them. Or to contrast that with passive communication, a person who doesn't defend their own personal boundaries, is manipulated because of fear, will not risk influencing anyone else. I'm sure we can think of people who are both aggressive communicators and passive communicators. Now, the middle ground with this one is assertive communicators, respecting the boundaries of others rather than defending or trying to overcome other people's boundaries. You defend yourself as well, not just respecting boundaries, but defending them. And you overcome the fear of speaking your mind, and overcome the fear of trying to influence others. So in assertiveness, an assertive person is someone who focuses on the issue and not the people. You're someone who expresses your feelings, thoughts, and your desires. You have anger. You express that anger. You don't repress that anger, but you have control over your anger. You're willing to compromise and cooperate, and you know your rights. So assertive negotiation is about finding the middle ground. It's a focus on solving the problem where your feelings and thoughts are not repressed, your boundaries are respected, you're looking for win-win outcomes, you have openness to reason, and you're yielding to principle. Now, why are we talking about this at the beginning of a conversation about licensing and pricing? Well, because in negotiation with an outside party, with a vendor, this often needs to be said. It needs to be repeated. People feel concerned about being someone who speaks their mind, to be the one who speaks up and asks for a price decrease, to be the one who asks for a change in the license agreement, requires assertiveness to some extent. And sometimes you deal with vendors who will push your boundaries, and in many cases, in some cases, can make you very angry. And it's important that you express that anger in a controlled but valid way, because that your anger is an important part of the communication that you have. I am not afraid of speaking my mind when it comes to things that make me angry with a vendor. I, of course, try to take time so that it's not a venting or a lashing out, but it's a respectful expression of the situation that is currently occurring. And in most cases, that has led to better communication with the vendor. And I'm not looking necessarily to get my way, but it's certainly important for me to express when things are happening that I'm not happy with. And in the case last year, I had a vendor who was, it taking forever, for like 6 weeks to come back with a price quote. And it was important for me to, but kind of giving me this attitude like this was my problem, that I needed it so fast, quote unquote. And there was a lot of frustration with that vendor at that time. And I have a lot of, that particular topic was important for me to express that anger. I want to talk a little bit about pitfalls in the process. Again, we've just been talking about assertive negotiation, and I want to talk a little bit about things that might hang you up with being an assertive negotiator. One thing that I find is relying on stereotypes. The stereotype of the librarian, I'm sure we are familiar with the stereotype that comes from media, that we are passive, that we are meek, mousy, indecisive, maybe we're the easy mark. We're seen as soft negotiators. This is contrasted with your vendor sales rep, who is a well-dressed, well-paid, loud, pushy. I mentioned Glengarry Glen Ross earlier. You're familiar with that stereotype of the vendor sales rep as well. This comes into play as well with the feminine versus masculine stereotypes, the idea that whether we're male or female, as a person who is a librarian, the profession is seen as feminine. Whether we're male or female as a vendor sales rep, the profession is seen as masculine. These are these lend to our credibility as the person who is in the role. So a person who is a librarian in a feminine profession may be seen as whiny if they're assertive, because nice people aren't pushy people. There are lots of sexism and double standards, whether or not we're male or female. We see women who ask as being more pushy than a man who asks. And many of us are not socialized to ask for things, even when asking for things is part of the process, which it is. And of course, in the vendor sales rep world, assertiveness is power, and assertiveness that borders on aggression is tolerated. Now, I want to reiterate again, we're talking about stereotypes here, but sometimes it can be, you can fall into the idea of seeing yourself as pitted against, as a librarian pitted against someone who is this slick, loud, pushy person. And getting into that idea can drag you down, can make you feel like you're a victim in this situation. And it was something I had to work on quite a lot when I was starting out as a new negotiator in the process. There are stereotypes for our organizations as well. The idea of the vendor organization being the soulless corporate behemoth, or the quote, dark side. And you'll hear that term, the dark side, that's used quite a lot, non-ironically. Library is seen as the poor, pitiful, broke library. We're on the side of the angels. We are the ones with, that we should not have to fight for these things. This should be something that we are, it should be obvious that we need this stuff. And so again, we're getting into these stereotypes where even if you may really have a good relationship with your vendor salesperson, you may see the vendor organization as a monolith that can't be reasoned with. And we want to definitely break down these stereotypes. These stereotypes are wrong, and it's counterproductive to rely on them. Librarians, we are diverse in age, gender, and appearance. We are not just meek, mousy librarians. We're strong, we're confident, we're knowledgeable and experienced. We're ready to fight for access. And the vendor rep stereotype is also out of date. They are diverse in age, gender, and appearance as well. They are often former librarians, or they hold an MLS. And they are required to do a lot of travel for their paycheck. And they can be just as annoyed by the policies and politics of their vendor organization, but they may be more privy to the specialized information that doesn't go out in the press, that doesn't go out on the listservs for the librarians to see it over. So there can be quite a very different idea of what a real vendor rep is, just as there is the librarian doesn't adhere to the stereotypes. So again, it's just really important not to get bogged down in these stereotypes and feel that this is an issue that you may not be able to overcome, that it's out of your hands. The stereotypes for libraries and vendor organizations are also wrong. Many vendor organizations are small nonprofit publishers. Overwhelmingly, vendor organizations give good discounts to education and libraries while making most of their profits off their corporate clients. Library budget woes have a direct result on vendor budgets, and these are people who generally really get bothered by hearing themselves described as the dark side, because that's not exactly accurate, and it's not exactly fair. And libraries don't all flip the image either. Not all libraries have had the same kind of budget issues in the last few years, although most of us have. The rise of e-resources has coincided with the economic crisis quite a lot. So many libraries have been able to take the opportunity to realign and strategize with funding that was formerly used for print collections. So it's a small, good thing, but it is kind of a major part of that. So it's just counterproductive and unhealthy to see everything as an us versus them kind of strategy. Even though we're talking about negotiation, we don't want this to become an us versus them. We want everyone to understand the access is the goal. Whether the libraries have the funding for it, whether the vendors can come down in price enough for us to afford it. They want us to have that access, and we want to have that access as much as possible. So it's important for everyone to have a good working relationship, that we're treating everyone like people here. That library world is a small world. You're going to run across library vendor reps a lot. Whether they end up staying in that same organization, they could leave to go to a different organization, or they could come work for your library. That can all happen. The market's not changing very fast either, and so these relationships will last for a very long time. It can a relationship with a vendor rep can last for months, years, or even a decade. And of course, librarians depend on really good customer support and technical support from a vendor. And burning a bridge can make that really difficult to happen. Vendors know a good relationship can lead to more business in the future. Librarians are not quiet about their experience with a vendor, and that kind of information put out there on the blogosphere or on listservs can really damage a reputation for a vendor. So it's important to a vendor to keep us happy. And librarians can understand that a good relationship with a vendor can make the process go much more smoothly. A vendor can make for a very long trial, for instance, or an extension on a quote. They can give a big discount or point the library towards a consortium that can provide a discount. They could provide options for training to increase usage. They can pressure technical support or billing to resolve a problem, and I can't tell you how many times that has really been helpful when you have someone who you know you can escalate the problem to because they want to make you happy, because that's what their business is. And of course you have situations like, you know, swag or lunches on the expense account and invitations to parties when you're at conferences. Now, of course, all of that part should be subject to rules as to what you can accept, especially if you're a public employee. But let's be honest. That's a perk as well. So, in being an assertive negotiator with a vendor, we have to recognize that both of us are part of the solution. That clear, concise communications are important to resolving issues. We need to be able to feel that we can make our case for whatever it is that we need. But we also need to recognize that we have to pick our battles. We can't fight every fight as though it's the last battle. We have to look for mutual gain. We want win-win outcomes. We need to be aware of the market, and in that case I mean aware of the market for the product that you're looking for. Being aware if that's health science information, you're aware of the different products that are out there, and you're aware of the stakeholders in your organization and out there. And the last thing is that confidence in negotiation will come from experience with this. That is something I've definitely learned over the last few years, that the more I do it, better I am at it, and the more confident I feel at it. And I can't say that enough. So I'll probably say it again later on, but not right now. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about negotiations in practice. For vendor communications, it's really important that you're getting things in writing. Many vendors really love to talk on the phone rather than send an email, but you should follow up each call with an email that documents the conversation. I like to send it in bullet points, especially if I'm asking them for information or they're supposed to follow up with me for information. I can't underestimate, I can't understate that enough. And there are a lot of vendor reps who really love just to deal with phone calls, and I understand that to some extent. I do feel wary of a vendor rep who only wants to deal in phone calls, especially one who then I never hear from except for sporadic phone calls and never gets back to me on the questions that I'm asking. Obviously, that's an issue that then I have to deal with. It's important to retain your records, whether those are emails or if you just keep things in notes format. I think that keeping emails as long as you possibly can. There have been many times where I've had to go back to emails that definitely last year's emails and certainly emails from 3 or 4 years ago. I rarely throw anything out. Now, of course, you may have a records retention schedule with a records management organization, so you need to keep that in account, take that into account, but I think that retaining emails as long as possible is important. In communication with a vendor, deadlines are really crucial. There are so many cases where you will send an email off to a vendor and maybe never get a response. You certainly aren't going to get a response the same day. Maybe it will take another week. You send another email after a week, and then the email kind of brings somebody back, and actually you get some contact from them on that. But it's really important to give them deadlines if you have deadlines that you need to meet. And if things are just keep going and going and you don't really even have a deadline, sometimes making up an artificial deadline is an important part of this process. Tell them that you need it by the end of the week or even by the end of the day. And if you don't get a response to that, that's when I escalate. I think that is the deadline is an extremely important part of this sometimes. The value of a phone call can also be important. I like to send most things in email because if they're getting it in writing. But every once in a while you have a vendor rep who doesn't get back to you in email over and over and over. Multiple emails go unresponded to. And it's amazing how quickly you can get a response and a resolution to your issue by just making the phone call to the right person. And then, of course, also knowing how to escalate that concern as well. For tech support or billing, you can escalate by contacting your sales rep. Now, if your sales rep is the person for tech support and billing, then that's a different issue. But in many bigger organizations, you can be mired in a conflict with billing or tech support for weeks and never get anywhere, but you somehow CC that sales rep on the issue, and that it's resolved within a week sometimes. Now, that's not always the case, but it's amazing how fast a sales rep can get something done in that organization. For the sales, if you need to escalate the problem, contacting your sales rep's manager is the way to go. I will sleuth on the internet to find organization charts to go even higher if necessary, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It's also important in your communications with a vendor to know what the difference is between a deal breaker and the things that are not deal breakers. And we generally, when we're negotiating, we try to ask for more than what we need in order to have what we need be what we get. But sometimes when we ask for things, we get them. And so I am not afraid to ask for things that, even if it isn't a deal breaker, even if the campus isn't willing to walk away from this deal, it's still important, to try sometimes. And a lot of times I get what I'm asking for. So, and the more often that happens, the more confident I am in actually asking for it. Now, if it is a deal breaker, as in you or the selector or the campus is willing to walk away from the deal if you can't get your way, this is often your best chance to get what you want, because it is your most powerful position for negotiation. They want you to have access. They want you to be paying them for that access. But it's definitely the lose-lose option. If you end up walking away, you don't get access, and the vendor doesn't get paid. So if you're in a situation where there is a deal breaker, you can often look for a creative solution that might solve both of your problems. In some cases, they put you in a position where there really isn't a creative solution. That definitely exists. But sometimes you can look to see if there are ways, smaller packages that you can negotiate, if you could break things off piecemeal if you're dealing with a large aggregated database. So looking for some kind of way to solve that issue, that problem, is a great way to, looking for a creative way to solve the problem. It's often welcomed by the vendor. They do want you to pay them for something, so that can often be a way to approach it. So when we're doing negotiation on pricing, there are several ways to negotiate the initial price from a vendor. Consortial deals are a pretty obvious one to me because I'm involved with consortium, but there are a lot of consortial deals. You can look around, even if you're not a member of the consortia, many will allow you to enter a deal for a product in exchange for a non-member fee. And whether that fee negates your savings or not is a different story, but there are often deals out there that you can join that will lower your price a bit. Now, sometimes that takes some work on your part to figure out what consortia are out there that you are a member of or that will let you join, that you are eligible to be a non-member of exist, and those should definitely be a first stop for some of these first initial prices, especially if the initial price that you get from the vendor is out of your budget, but maybe just slightly out of your budget where a discount would help a lot. Another thing you can look for is a multi-year pricing schedule. This involves locking you in for multiple years that will lower your price increase from year to year. One thing to note about this is the price increase cap can vary within the agreement, such as within a 5-year agreement, the cap doesn't necessarily need to be 3% every year, but you could do a cap for 2% the first year, 2% the second year, 3% the third year, 3% the fourth year, and 4% the fifth year, or some kind of variation on that the vendor will agree to. And because maybe they wouldn't come down to 2% for all 5 years, but you didn't want to go to 4% for all 5 years either. So sometimes those can be a good way of saving some money on the price. Now that does lock you in, and especially if you're dealing with a new resource, the campus may not be, or the library may not want to be locked in for an entire, for 5 years or 3 years or any period of time. But those do exist. One thing to talk about with pricing schedules is that you should have an escape clause built into your license agreement if you're doing a multi-year pricing schedule, because the escape clause should give you an out if your organization is facing major budget problems. This is something I always try to get into a license agreement. If I'm doing a multi-year pricing schedule, it's just good to have that in a license agreement anyway. Procurement requirements. Now, you may not be a state organization subject to procurement requirements. They are required. Like in this case, I'm talking about something like a bid and a quote process, the RFB, the RFP, the RFI. These are required by some institutions, but I want to point out that they do play a role in negotiation, even if they're not required by your institution. Many times I've been able to keep a product, even if the product is not over my threshold for meeting a bid, but putting it out to bid will give me a better price than if I had not bidded at all. And so that's kind of an important thing. Now, of course, in this situation, we're talking about something that's a sole source item, but or not a sole source item where you can get it from multiple vendors, and that's fewer and fewer far between at this point. Many of these organizations, vendor organizations, have consolidated or signed exclusionary deals so that the product is really only available one place. But for those products that are still out there that you can still get from multiple distributors, being able to use a bid process can save you some money sometimes. And talk about it. That is an important part of the vendor negotiation as well. Talking in real terms about your particular budget is important for the vendor to hear that and pass that up the chain. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll be able to do anything about it. But the economic crisis is now is a new standard of reality. And so sometimes you'll find that middle managers in corporate organizations are in a bit of a bubble. They are, their vendor organization isn't necessarily seeing the same kind of budget issues that a library is seeing, and it is really important for the sales rep to be telling a middle manager, sales manager, that that this is what the libraries are seeing, so that they can pass that on up, so that organizations can be aware of that libraries are going to be increasingly more likely to pull back from deals because they can't afford things, because that's the budget that we're in. We can't make money out of nothing. And maybe it won't bring you closer together in terms of price now. Maybe it won't make any difference. But when the vendor organization hears that story over and over again, they may do something about it. And then you also want to talk about the market. You are out there looking at particular products that within generally the same kind of products within the market, whether you're, again, whether you're law and doing law school, whether you're a public library, if you're looking at those kind of products, you're looking at a specific market of products. And if you don't think that if you think that their product is out of line with the market, you need to tell them that. They often think that they are a special snowflake that has a specific access to a product that no one else can provide, but that's not necessarily how the rest of us see it. And it's really important to say, well, that's not how we see it, and we think that these other products are comparable to you and that they have a better deal available. Saying this to them, even though it may feel like they are not listening at all, can be very important. You can also talk about trials and start dates. For instance, you can negotiate with the vendor to start access to a product now, even if you won't be able to pay the bill until, let's say, July 1. Sometimes vendors are able to give 60 to 90 days of access for free, even if they know you're interested, So now we'll talk a little bit about license agreements and negotiation. You may not have lawyers on your staff. I do. I have a general counsel that reviews the final draft of the license agreement for legal issues. But they are not aware of or looking for library issues, and that's why I'm important in the process. You may not have a general counsel or on staff, and if not, then what you probably want is a workshop on library license agreements, and they exist. And what you want is at least a full day to go through this, and possibly even a multi-day process to go into the details of how to negotiate a license agreement. Because this, like I said earlier, this is the defining your relationship with the vendor. It is important. I have a few resources, and these will be repeated at the end, so you don't need to hurry to write these addresses down. These are mostly dealing with the academic libraries, but they can all be helpful. The CRL, Library Center for Research Libraries, has the LibLicense project, and that includes the LibLicense L listserv, which is very useful. But there's a lot of information on the website itself. For instance, they are the creators of a model license that is now in draft stage. That model license would be an idea that this is what a good license agreement would look like. So not only is that something that you could potentially show to a vendor if you were unhappy with the license agreement that they had, but you can also pretty much cannibalize that license agreement, the model license agreement. You can look at that and see, okay, this particular ILL statement on interlibrary loan is a good statement on that, and I would like to use this in the license agreement that I'm negotiating now that does not have a good statement on interlibrary loan. And so you can kind of do that with a lot of different license agreements. Is pick and choose and maybe even create your own go-to resource of good clauses that you feel are a strong, say strongly what you are looking for in that product, whether that's interlibrary loan or fair use, or even getting into things like text mining or MOOCs, what we call MOOCs. And I'll get into a little bit more. I don't want to go through the rest of these. The California Digital Library, which is the consortium of University of California libraries, has a really great website as well, including a licensing toolkit and a license agreement checklist that you may find really helpful. This website is aimed for use by the CDL only, but it is all available to you. Just don't go and sue them, please. Same with the other information. You're using these on your own terms. And then there was also SERU, the Shared Electronic Resource Understanding, and the idea was that this was put together by NISO, and it was a registry. The idea was that libraries will join a registry, publishers and vendors will join the registry, and now everybody's agreed to the same model license, and we skipped over that entirely. Nobody has to sign anything because we all agree to the same Shared Electronic Resource Understanding. We have been a part of that for many years. We have not had much success with it, though. Vendors still want their own license agreements. But it is out there, and I encourage you to look at it. And of course, you can create your own resources for this as well. Your existing license agreements. You want to be poring over your current files. If you're being asked to negotiate a new license agreement with a vendor, but an existing license agreement is currently in effect. Of course, you want to compare and contrast those as much as possible to see how differently the clauses have been, if there have been any changes or anything like that. And it's also important to look over those licenses, like I said, with that model license, and see if there's any particular clauses in there that you find are a good representation of what you want in a license agreement. And maybe pull out those clauses and keep them in a separate document so that you can look at those when you're negotiating a new license agreement. I find that a checklist is really important. That when I look at a new license agreement and I have a checklist next to me to make sure that I'm looking for the same things every time. Walk-in access is really important because I am negotiating on behalf of public universities. ILL use, both print and electronic, course packs and e-reserves. Indemnification is really important for us. I can't indemnify any organization. I can't promise to do that within a license agreement. We also, as a public university in the state of Missouri, can't agree to a governing law that states the state of Pennsylvania or the state of Ohio or even another country, because we are the state of Missouri. So in those cases, if I can't get the vendor organization to agree to change it to the state of Missouri, then usually they will agree to strike it completely. Or in many cases, I'll be able to substitute a clause that says that we should be able to have the walk-in access, or it says that this will work with fair use, or we can use course packs or e-reserves, and that information that comes from, like I said, a document that I've compiled that has different clauses in it, and I find that extremely helpful. New issues that have come up now that may be important for your libraries is text and data mining, the use of MOOCs, or even negotiating to make sure that the product you are looking at will be accessible through your discovery service. So those are things that are out there. If you go out to the CRL website, there is information on a lot of this out there specifically. So I encourage you to look at that. And I'll have those websites up again at the end. So when you're talking with a vendor over the changes in a license agreement, you need to make sure that you are negotiating with a licensing expert at the vendor, someone who has clout, someone who understands what the license is, and understands that your business is important. Sometimes you're just talking with a sales manager and they are resistant to changing the license agreement because it is a hassle. Maybe it's a small publisher, they don't have a lawyer on staff, changing the license agreement is a giant hassle. That sort of thing. But it's important to explain what the issue is, why it's a problem for you. They should focus on that issue and not just on the hassle, because this is something that's important to you. And maybe even if they aren't willing to change language because they don't have a lawyer on staff, they may be willing to strike language. So getting back to the governing laws and the indemnification and that kind of thing. Of course, you should be working only in writing at this point. You can often ask for an editable version of the license agreement, for instance, a Word version of it if it's just sent to you in PDF. It's nice if you can just edit the actual text and the track changes, forward that back to them, and then they can see what you're changing without you having to go point by point. But it is important for you to send along an email with that change document that addresses your changes bullet by bullet and gives justifications. I have found that this is often extremely successful. Most times they will totally agree to everything that I ask them to do. Just like when I said at the beginning, asking for more than I need, there are many times when there's a lot more in that license agreement that I'd be willing to settle for. And oftentimes I get it. And it's obviously extremely gratifying to feel to see something change the way that I want it to, and getting the access that I want to have for my patrons. The big thing, of course, is price negotiation. Oh, I want to get back to this for a second on deal breakers within a license agreement. if there turns out to be a deal breaker and you're walking away, their organization should be aware that you're walking over licensing language. You should spell that out in an email and copy that email to as many different people as you know in that organization, even finding vice presidents from the organization's website. They don't want to be putting a license agreement out there that makes people walk away from their product. They want to sell you the product. They want you to subscribe to the product. So make sure they're totally aware that that is what's happening. Okay, going up to pricing. The pricing in this situation is that that you should not be afraid to ask on the pricing at all. That can be something, again, you can get what you ask for in many cases, but in some cases you don't, and you often want to make sure that you are handling it nicely and well. The phrasing that I liked a lot when I was starting out was explaining. First, I would explain the budget issues as well as tracking the trends of the price over time. But I would like to. I am asking you for consideration on the price. Always seemed to me to be a nicer way of phrasing that than can you lower this price or can you decrease the price for me? Now I feel a little more confident in asking for those things straight out, but consideration on the price is a nice way of dealing with it. I try to justify it with facts and figures. I'm very clear about the budget situation, like I said earlier, and I also use trends. I have, I'm doing the usage of the product, but I'm also tracking price increases over time. And if I'm seeing a record of the price going up 10% by every year, that's an issue for me, and I try to bring that up with the vendor. I don't want to be seeing that kind of thing. Now, of course, I have to know my vendors. Some vendors just aren't going to budge, but I don't know until I ask. And sometimes I keep asking, even if I know they're not going to budge, because maybe one year they will budge, and it might be that important to me. All right, so that slide got out of order. Sorry about that. When you're doing pricing renewals, you want to start really early. I try to start renewals 60 to 90 days in advance to get everything completed on time. Vendors like that a lot. It enhances our relationship because I pay promptly or even early. I like to also remind the vendor of existing price caps or schedules and help them solve the problems before they come up. I like to be the one who's doing that. They know that I'm going to be helpful in this process. When I get the price, I compare that and track the trends from last year, and I ask for a price decrease if it's necessary, using that consideration on the price language. I've never been able to track, or I haven't yet tracked how many times I am successful in negotiating the price. That is something I actually want to do at some point. But most expect the negotiation and will lower the price for me. I look for equivalent products or vendors or another distributor, but like I said, consolidation and exclusivity contracts seem to be doing away with this. But even sole source products can still be negotiated. And then I mentioned multi-year pricing and consortial deals is something that you can even look for if this is an existing renewal for you. One thing that drives me crazy is the addenda or appendices that need to be signed every year. I don't want to have to put something through, get a signature on something every year. It slows down my process. So I try to get those out of the way by putting something in the license agreement that doesn't allow for that. There's other negotiation that takes place as well that you have to recognize is happening. That may be with your selectors or with your faculty. Faculty may not understand the market. Selectors may not understand particular vendors. They may understand vendors in general, but they may not understand this particular vendor or the particular vendor sales rep that you're working with. And sometimes what you have to do is negotiate within your organization while you're negotiating with outside party as well. Another group that I find that I'm often negotiating with is my own organization's accounting and procurement people. Our resources can't be purchased like tires or computers or soft drinks. We can't substitute a different product or at a lower price. And we have fewer options in terms of availability from vendors. So it often is difficult for me to get some of this through the accounting people. Luckily, I've been pushing and pushing and pushing over the years, and we're at a good point now where they understand what I do. So this is obviously a huge topic, and we've talked a lot in the last since this presentation started. I hope that some of this has been helpful. There are a lot of resources out there on negotiation, lots of workshops. I highly recommend a very in-depth one on negotiating license agreements, especially if that is something that you need to do. There are lots of books on negotiation in general that are helpful. I like Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In by Robert Fisher and William Ury. And there are lots of articles out there in our profession about basics of these processes. So I encourage you to look it all up. And the more experience you get, that will lead to your confidence and to feeling that you are going to be successful with this. So here's my email address again, and some of the resources I mentioned. And I'm going to, Felicity's going to ask me some questions now.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah, we've gotten several questions, and just to remind people, if you have a question, type it into the question box. So Abby, you started out by talking about relationships. So here's a question, and it's about figuring out to whom you express that anger. This person just had that same situation with a vendor, refusing to give me a price quote in a timely manner. So how do you figure out who you take your anger to?
Well, in the case that I was in, that vendor sales rep was not the person who was the hang-up, but I can, in a nice, again, gently and without lashing out, I sent an email that explained that this was a hang-up for me, and they were asking me to put them in a kind of a favored position. I think this was in a situation where it was almost a formal quote process, if not a bid process. So they were required to fulfill it within a certain amount of time, and they weren't fulfilling it within that certain amount of time, which looked like I was giving them some preferential treatment. So I was explained that in great detail. And I explained that I was angry and pointed out the issues that I was having with them. Again, without venting, and I had, my business manager look over the email just to make sure that none of it looked too mean. But it was a situation where I was pretty angry. So asking other people to help make sure that you're staying on track might be helpful in those situations. But,
so if you want to go around someone, how do you find someone other than the person you're working with?
It's important to know who your sales manager or your sales rep reports to. And if that's the sales manager or there's a sales director, a lot of that information is on the website, and they'll tell you if you ask them. And sometimes they are happy to give you that information because they would like to get you out of their hair or something like that. Like I said, the organization charts are often found on the website, and maybe, like I said, a well-placed phone call can often get some information. If you called the main number and said, who do I speak to, who's the sales manager for this region, or for who is the supervisor for this particular person, the person answering the phone may just tell you. And so try to work that if you can.
Okay. Do you have the language to cover an exit clause in case your institution needs to break out?
I don't know it off. I'm not going to be able to recite it chapter and verse right here. I can send you an example of what I would use or what I have in current license agreements. You could also look on the websites that are currently up on the screen with the CRL and the CDL and see if there are some exit clauses up there that work better for you. But feel free to email me and I can send that to you.
Okay, and we can try to get that to send out with our other stuff. You mentioned price caps. So what do you mean by price caps when receiving quotes?
Well, when I'm receiving a quote, a quote process for me, it is a specific procurement requirement. So anything that is under a certain amount of money, and I have multiple distributors or producers for that product, I have to get quotes from all of them and go with the lowest quote. But I can put in a multi-year pricing schedule of sorts with someone like that. That would fall under, my procurement people would agree that that is okay. So in that case, I would, because it's a formalized process, I will ask anybody who is going to be responding to that quote with a quote, that they will stay to this particular price cap for that period of time, whether usually 3 years, 3 to 4 years. And if they respond back with a quote, they're agreeing to the stipulations that are clearly outlined in the email that I've sent them or the document that I've sent them. And for the most part, that will work. If you don't get a response back from a vendor, then you know that they don't agree to that. So that's something to keep in mind. But that when I say quote, I meant that in a formalized quote process.
Okay. I just want to mention, someone mentioned that the CDL model licenses has early termination language and funding contingency language, and you have that resource in your PowerPoints. Okay. One person asks for an explanation if the renewal is more than 5% increase from year to year. If they don't have a reasonable explanation, she'll ask for a decrease. So what is your rule of thumb for asking for price decreases?
It's lowered, actually. I'm now doing 3%. I like the 5%. 5% is good, but oftentimes I don't, especially with specific vendors where I know that they're going to just give me 4% out the door, and I usually think that they can come down a little lower, then I will ask them anyway. And so usually if it's under 3%, I think that's reasonable. 3% is still over the national rate of inflation, so I feel that is, and I often point that out in the email, that 3% is over the national rate of inflation. So if it's over 3%, between 3 and 4%, I might not. I'll probably let that slide. But once we're talking 4%, then I'm negotiating that for sure. I'm asking anyway. Doesn't mean I get it, but I ask.
How do libraries know when they're getting the best possible deal? How do you know when it's time to quit negotiating and accept the deal?
Oftentimes, if I've asked and they've said that this is as much, they give me a justification for it, I will usually accept that. If I don't believe them or something to that extent, I may push harder. I may try to talk to them on the phone. It depends how much money is at stake. Some of the resources that I handle not just consortial resources, but also individual resources. So some of them are small school and small amounts of money, and some of them are in, $50,000, $100,000, $500,000. So it depends how much money we're talking about here. And some cases it's pretty obvious, and sometimes it isn't. It's one of those. It's a hard thing to say. But if I'm keep pushing with the vendor, then often I will get some response or justification. And if that satisfies me, then we're probably where we're at with it. And it depends on, from what I do, the selector is going to make the ultimate decision on whether or not that is the best deal. Okay.
We have several questions here, so I'm going to give you a final one and then ask you to answer the other ones offline.
I'd be happy to do
that. So this is somewhat of a follow-up on that one. How do you feel about contract restrictions, discussing pricing with staff or other libraries? The contract restrictions about discussing the pricing with staff or other libraries that a vendor might require.
I think that's reasonable. I try to do that as a matter of course. We have all of our pricing information behind a paywall, not paywall, behind a password wall on our, we have a wiki and things here at our library. I try to remind people that cost information is sensitive, and that I will follow along with that. Now, if you feel uncomfortable with that and you want to share it, and I've seen lots of discussions about that out there. I think that maybe participating in an anonymous survey about it is perfectly reasonable, but I will respect that kind of restriction on discussing cost. As far as the discussion of license agreement terms, there should be a good reason for whether they want to restrict that or not. But the cost, I think that's reasonable, and we follow those procedures as it is.
Well, thank you very much, Abby. That was very helpful. And everyone, so today you will be getting soon a evaluation, and we ask that you fill that out. We use that as we plan additional webinars. You'll also be getting an email with a link to the recording and PowerPoint slides. and Abby will be addressing some of these other questions offline. So we have 3 more webinars this year, 2 on MOOCs and 1 on RDA. In addition, we are planning our fall schedule. So if you have some ideas, please fill out a proposal form if you have a solid idea, or email someone on the ALCTS committee, and we'll follow up on those. I also want to thank our tech support people, Eva Sorrell and Vicki Grzinski. They help to keep our webinars running smoothly. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to you joining us at other ALCTS continuing education offerings.